In general, human beings tend to be very, very poor at managing the relationship between long stretches of time and the time that they live in and exist in. And so we typically think of our own epoch, our own moment in time, as perhaps not independent of others, but we might as well think that way because we typically live and act in accordance with a view that would at least suggest that we think it's independent of others. Which is to say, history, of course, exists, and history is connected to the present, but it's not terribly relevant. And in some sense, it's true. The past is the past, and it's done, and we have, to varying degrees, moved on from the past, but we're also connected to the past. Every event in the past, every cultural innovation, every historical period is tied to our present, sometimes intimately and sometimes less so, but we are, for example, connected to feudalism, even though feudalism has ceased to be for quite some time, and we're also connected to mercantilism. These are, of course, you could argue, economic systems, but the reason why we live in the current economic system we do is because in the past, whole societies attempted other economic systems that worked for a time, but ended up not working out so well because of various historical exigencies and experiences. And the existence of our current economic system, say free markets or what have you, is a consequence of that. Observations and historical cycles that, frankly speaking, did not withstand the so-called test of time. And the same is true of what I refer to as generational transfer. We tend to look oftentimes at generational gaps in a vacuum. We rarely think about, say, the Victorian era, the end of the 19th century, as being relevant to our own time. And even things such as the sexual revolution in the 1960s, in the early 70s, sure, we can view some of the connections there, but typically most people don't make the connection. No, we live in our own time. We live in the early 21st century. It exists unto itself, or does it? And so, really what I want to talk about today is the concept of generational transfer. The transfer of memes, memetic transfer of culture over time that is subsequently integrated into a greater system, which is to say, we have the events of the sexual revolution and the many things that occurred in the 20th century that help shape our current day politics and has helped shape the way generations view things. Now, of course, there are these memes. I don't mean memes in the original sense, but memes in the sense of, okay, boomer. But for example, people who were born in the late 40s or 50s went through these critical periods, and they helped to shape the landscape in the decades to come. The system that we've inherited is a direct consequence of the events that they helped shape and live through. And one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because one thing people miss very, very frequently, extraordinarily frequently, is the fact that we are living in history right now. History is taking place even as I speak. And when we look at current events, again, we tend to look at them in a vacuum. But one of the things that many of us lament and bemoan, myself included, has been the Great Awakening as a very prominent example of this. The overwhelming trend throughout the West, specifically in the United States, towards a very, very far left form of politics, and one that is possessed of progressivism, specifically. And then we think to ourselves, especially if we're not fans of it, and we think, this too shall pass. Now, without a doubt, eventually it will pass. But the real question to pose here with respect to the Great Awakening is whether or not it will pass never having left its mark. And in this instance, I would refer you to the events of the 20th century. Say again, the 1960s and the sexual revolution, the impact of birth control, what it did to people in terms of the mating and dating game. Well, certainly things became a lot faster and a lot looser. We can observe this. And if we're to compare back then with the current instantiation of things, well, I think it'd be an understatement to claim that they are any less fast or loose. If anything, they are far, far, far more the case. And therefore, generations carry their own cultural memes forward. And they don't just disappear. Yes, the quote-unquote sexual revolution is technically over, but the reality is that when we truly examine the sexual revolution's consequences, we rather quickly come to the conclusion that it never left us. Tinder, OnlyFans, ubiquitous porn, all this stuff can be traced back to that ultimately, to varying degrees, sexual liberation, etc. And I'm not pronouncing a judgment on that per se, not at this moment. I'm just saying that one tends to look at these things myopically. The sexual revolution took place between this and this year. Sure. In fact, by most people's reckoning, the sexual revolution took place primarily between the 1960s and 1980s. But we're close to 40 years away from that, technically. But everything that was achieved by the sexual revolution is still here, and very observable, and far, far more pronounced in terms of its expression. And so you might be asking why I'm bringing this up. And the reason for that is quite simple. We may very well wish, in some state of dazed reverie, that the awakening and the type of progressivism we bear witness to will simply get up and disappear eventually. It'll fade, right? And yes, in a technical sense, if history is any judge or guide, it will fade. But it won't fade into something completely different or new. In all likelihood, it will get worse. Progressivism, awakening, however you want to term these things are things that are going to become part of the culture. Notice when people talk about Tinder and OnlyFans and the general dating and mating sexual dynamic in the current year, very few people refer to it as the sexual revolution because it's just a given. And so many of the things that have come to pass now are just a given. And what's even more likely is as these things become just another given of our culture and our society and our civilization, the natural consequence of that will be pushing the envelope even further than had been previously done, with the exception that it won't be viewed as very strange, because going forward, it will all just be part and parcel of this glorious social construct we call society. And here's where we come back to generational transfer. The people that promote these things and the people that are interested in these things are typically young, but they will get older. And their values, as quixotic and strange as they are, will become the norms of tomorrow. And as a consequence, they will be pushed forward and fully integrated, memetically speaking, into the next generation. Now, I know a lot of people think there's going to be a counter to this, but if we think about the nature of conservatism, we could best observe that conservatives are not very good at conserving anything. The Republicans of today are a bit like the Democrats of the mid-1990s, as an example. Conservatives conserve what used to be, but what used to be isn't what it was always, and therefore whatever conservatives will be conserving going forward might actually be a mirror reflection of 2021 politics, as it were, in 2030 or 2040. Who knows? But it certainly is a possibility going forward, and one that we have to seriously entertain. So, to all those who feel a sense of hope that the Great Awakening will soon end, or end after a certain period of time, yes, it will, but the Great Awakening will simply become the normalcy of the future. And unfortunately, because I say this as a person who is not a fan of the cultural politics of our time, there probably won't be any way to avoid it. People are not simply going to come to their senses. This is something probably as big as the cultural revolutions of the past. We just don't think of it in the current context because human beings are myopic and we typically don't connect the dots. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. As always, please leave a like, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos, share the video. And as always, if I'm still alive, hale and healthy, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.